Welcome, Sean. It's wonderful to have you join us all the way from Tokyo.
Thanks for having me.
So what time is it in Tokyo?
It is 6:30 in the morning.
6:30 in the morning. You're an early bird. You get up early to cover the news. I can see that.
The hazards of most of the things I cover happening outside of the country I live in.
So I'm going to get straight into it because I think we've got a very exciting conversation that's going to take place. So a few weeks ago, I was reading the Wall Street Journal. I always start my day reading the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times. It's, a ritual in my house. Everyone does it. And I came across this article that you and your colleague put together, Nick Kostov, where you talked about I think it may have been an extract from the book Boundless, but it talked about what happened with the whole saga that was going on in Japan and so on, the famous Carlos. And one of the things that struck me is how little the world knew about one of the most famous CEOs in the world. And when I read that article, I thought, my God, this is one of the most interesting things I've ever read. And I think more people need to understand someone who had so much power, but so little was known about it. So my starting point for you is, how did you figure out there was another story there?
Well, that's an excellent question, and it really gets to why we ultimately decided to write a book. So our book is Boundless, as you mentioned, about
Yeah.
the career of Carlos Ghosn, his rise, his fall, and ultimately, as you referenced, his escape. And it struck Nick and I as we reported this story over many years that it was just absolutely baffling that Carlos Ghosn was one of the most public figures in the world. He
Yes.
was on every evening news broadcast. He was the face of Davos. He ran two of the most recognizable car brands in the world, Renault and Nissan. But nobody knew anything about him. Carlos Ghosn had very few people close to him. He was very closely guarded about his private life.
Yeah.
And it stunned Nick and I as were writing this book that Carlos Ghosn's father had been arrested for murder in Lebanon when Carlos Ghosn was 6 years old. And it's just absolutely stunning that something that was freely available in the public
Yes.
was just unknown for his entire career. So there was very little that was known about how he worked in his private life. Probably would have remained unknown had he not been suddenly arrested on charges of corporate finance misdeeds in 2018.
So when you started exploring his life, these interesting pieces compelled you to keep searching, or did you feel that there was something that could be wrong, for lack of a better word, in terms of what he was doing?
Well, it's a bit of both, to
A
be
bit of both.
honest.
Yeah.
I mean, what drove us to write the book is that we were struggling in 800 to 1,000, 2,000, even 3,000 word news stories to really express all the context that helps you
Yes.
understand
You've got
how
tough
we
editors, I'm
got
sure.
here.
Yeah.
The Wall Street Journal, we have the toughest in the business. Yeah. And you really can't understand how a man who literally went from a small town in the Amazonian rainforest to the heights of the corporate world,
Yes.
and then was sort of ended his career in infamy, unless you really understood the whole sweep of his life,
Yes.
thing along those ways. Because ultimately, what happened with Carlos Ghosn is you have a highly successful, probably one of the most effective and well-regarded corporate executives of our generation, who threw his legacy away chasing, a couple tens of millions of dollars. And that was just a baffling thing and a difficult thing to convey in a series of news articles. And really, you don't get to the bottom of it until you put it together in a book. And that's
Yes.
what we've done here. And I think once you really step back and look at his entire life, you really understand the motivations and both his virtues and his flaws that sort of shaped his decision making.
Yeah, there's two things that struck me when I read the book, and obviously your reporting in the Wall Street Journal. The book, I feel, was necessary because you could just never capture the depth in your articles. There was no way you would get the space to actually do that. But the 2 points that jumped out at me was, I used to be a strategy partner in my previous life, so I obviously know many CEOs and captains of industry. But it got me thinking, how well do we really know them? because we only know what they choose to share with us. Our private lives are kept private. We don't really know what's happening. We assume the board's doing all the necessary checks and all the necessary steps have been put in place. But when you read what happened with Carlos, there seemed to have been a whole system set up to move money that no one had picked up on. How could it have gone on for so long?
So there's a couple questions. There's a couple questions in there, and to start with the first one about CEOs in general, you're right. Most CEOs are seen as these sort of larger than life figures.
Yeah,
Machinery of corporate PR, firms and outside PR firms, sort of create this story of who this person is, and they become a series of sound bites. There are some exceptions. Some CEOs excel at being more personable and more human.
yes,
I think Carlos Ghosn was the very opposite extreme, where his entire image was his management style.
yeah,
Carlos Ghosn was a superhero, superhuman CEO who could operate two Fortune 500 companies at the same time, operated by half the planet. He ran this special sort of corporate structure called the Renault Nissan Alliance that was not a merger, but a partnership of sort of mutual self interest. And there was just a lot of sort of themes of globalization and diversity and sort of good corporate governance that Carlos
yes,
Ghosn sort of embodied as a person, and we came to sort of identify the sound bites with his personality. There's obviously a real human behind all of these corporate images that are put out there, and I think it was a rare opportunity to have a situation like this where something so crazy
yeah,
had happened, that people were willing to sort of pull back the curtain and share a lot more about the person himself. And there's a lot to Carlos Ghosn's story that is not unique in terms of how they came to be the person they are. And there's a lot of qualities to CEOs that make them, for lack of a better word, slightly eccentric, not like you and
yeah,
I, that I'm sure are universal across all CEOs. And so there's a lot, I think, people can learn about the good qualities as well as the things to watch out for in your corporate leaders in this book. But then to get to the second part of your question, which is how something like this happened for so long. And there, the answer lies a lot in the corporate governance of Nissan and Renault and the alliance, and sort of corporate governance norms in Japan.
yeah,
So I guess I should back up and explain exactly what he was accused of doing.
yes,
So Carlos Ghosn was arrested in November 2018 as he stepped off his private jet on the way to a board meeting on accusations that he had, over a period of 10 years, understated his compensation in corporate filings by 50%.
okay,
And the actual mechanism of that is a bit weird and might strike a lot of our readers, or listeners rather, in the US and Europe as an odd accusation. So he was accused of secretly formulating deals with a number of his aides within
yes,
Nissan to postpone a portion of his compensation, to defer it until after retirement, by which he would have been allowed to avoid disclosure. Because
yes,
Carlos Ghosn had taken a pay cut in 2010 to avoid having to disclose his full compensation out of concern of the public backlash he would face in Japan and France. Now, Carlos Ghosn's defense at that portion of the criminal charges, and his co-defendant, a man named Greg Kelly, former Nissan executive and head of HR, was that they had been considering a number of ways to compensate Ghosn after retirement for consulting work and advisory work, but none
yes,
of those pay plans had been finalized. And so the debate here was whether or not those drafts of compensation plans were for work he'd done as a head of Nissan or not. So it was a weird sort of charge to start off with. But then there were a number of other charges related to his Carlos Ghosn's relationship with two
Before you
billionaires.
continue, Sean,
Go
before
ahead.
you continue, just for the audience, the crime he was charged for is deferring his compensation, which is illegal in Japan because he was actually understating his income.
So, yeah, let me be more specific here. He was charged with deferring his compensation and not disclosing it. So
Okay,
in
got it.
Japan, the law was that you had to disclose the compensation in the year for which it was set, right?
Okay,
So if,
makes sense.
say, in 2011, the company said, we're going to pay you $10 million 10 years from now, you would have to disclose that amount in 2011 under Japanese law.
Yes.
So again, I'm not sure that this would be a criminal act in a lot of jurisdictions where your listeners are, but that was criminal allegation, the first one.
Yes.
There were a number of other ones that are a lot easier to understand. And the reason why this first charge was allowed to go undetected for so long was a sort of quirk of the corporate governance of Nissan. So normally at a company, at a publicly held company, the individual or individuals who set the compensation of senior executives at a company are board members.
Yes.
Well, in Japan, until very recently, the board members were basically the senior executives of the company. There's very little difference in the membership there.
Yes.
And at Nissan, the board had divested their authority to set the compensation of those board directors to Carlos Ghosn.
Wait, I
Basically,
just want
the
to be clear about this, right?
yeah.
It's a bit fantastical that the board delegated the setting of compensation to the person whose compensation needs to be set.
Yes, Carlos Ghosn determined how much he was paid, and only Carlos Ghosn knew how much he was paid because the board had given him that authority.
Oh,
There
that
was
is very unusual. I think we can agree, right?
Well, that's unusual, and it's why nobody knew how much Carlos Ghosn was paid, and Carlos Ghosn liked it that way.
Yes.
And there was a sort of a key moment in the Carlos Ghosn story in 2010 when Japan changed the rules about executive compensation in the sort of midst of the financial crisis and the backlash against, sort of executive compensation that came out
Yeah.
all across the world at that time. And at that time, they decided that anybody who made more than roughly $1 million in Japan would have to let shareholders and the public know how much they earned. Carlos Ghosn was very vehemently opposed to this idea. The
Yes.
time he was making, I mean, depends on exchange rates, but between like 18 to $20 million US. That puts him in the upper echelons of sort of automotive CEO pay. It's certainly not the top by any means,
Yes.
but it was up there, and it was by and large cash compensation. And so, right before the law comes out, Carlos Ghosn returns a portion of his previous year's salary because the law was retroactive,
Yeah.
and basically takes a 50% pay cut. And so, a lot of the actions that get him in trouble from that point are efforts by Carlos Ghosn to figure out a way to not take a 50% pay cut, but also
Yes.
not have to tell shareholders and the public and not have to defend that compensation in public.
And also not pay taxes on it.
Well, I mean, yeah, I guess, but it depends on what the money was, right? Like
Yes.
he
Yes.
paid he paid taxes, and frankly, his compensation included very generous gross ups for global taxation. So
Yes.
I'm not sure he would have taken the hit. He had to pay tax on his
Wow.
full
So
compensation.
all of this not to avoid taxes, just to avoid the backlash.
Correct. It
Okay.
was it was it was a public image thing. Again, this goes back to, I guess, briefly what we touched upon about, the legend of Carlos Ghosn, if you want to
Yes.
call the sort of the PR sort of machinery about the CEO their legend. Carlos Ghosn had built a reputation of frugality and
Yes,
cost
I
cutting
understand.
and keen eye on bottom lines. And there was just going to be this disclosure of, not by global standards, unusual compensation, but certainly by Japanese standards, a very eye-opening amount of money. And
Yes.
even at 50%, when he ultimately disclosed his salary, he was still by far the highest paid CEO in Japan. And there was a bit of a backlash. And I don't know if all your listeners are familiar with the cultures of France and Japan.
It's very surprising to me this could have happened in Japan.
Well, yes and no. I mean, in Japan, there in Japanese companies, and actually Carlos Ghosn has said this in public himself in sort of retrospective of his time at Nissan before the arrest happened, after he had sort of stepped back as CEO and just became chairman. Carlos Ghosn credited his success at Nissan in large part to the deference that members of a company showed towards their leader.
Yes.
Carlos Ghosn said wherever I
Japanese
told them to
culture.
march, basically they would go in that direction.
Yeah.
Everybody moved in accordance to what the leader said. And he considered that a great privilege. It is true, looking at, his life as we sort of write it in his book, that Carlos Ghosn got what Carlos Ghosn wanted from Nissan. in part because of his track record of basically saving the company from bankruptcy in
Yes.
1999. And also, a significant series of wins over 20 years at the top of that company. He took them from borderline bankruptcy to
Yes.
becoming one of the most profitable and one of the largest car makers in the world. And there just seemed to be this air of Carlos Ghosn knows what's right. He's done what's right in the past. He's on our side. And therefore, we can leave him to his own devices. And that's the
Yes.
aspect of sort of Japanese corporate governance that I think was problematic in the Carlos Ghosn case. Because there is so much deference paid to the leader and this sort of, we've got a direction to go in, so everybody better get in line and move in the direction so we get
Yes.
there. Um, that works so long as the person in charge is doing the right thing for the right
Yeah.
reasons. And I think that's part of the reason why there was such a backlash against Carlos Ghosn, who went from being, one of the great heroes to one of its greatest villains in Japan, because there was this perception in Japan that he had taken the company's funds and assets and just the machinery of the company and the employees' lives and used them for his own private gain.
Yeah. It basically abused the trust.
Yeah, it was one of the extra charges was a breach of trust. And that was what really hit his reputation here. But again, the reason why it was allowed to occur and the reason why nobody knew about it, or very few people knew about it, was because they had divested all oversight and decision making to Carlos Ghosn's person when it came to compensation.
Okay. The more obvious question, but so at the time, what had he done illegally?
Well, that is a difficult question that maybe we'll never get the answer to because he isn't going to stand trial. Uh,
Yes.
like, you know, it is a bit of a minefield to try to say what he did was or was not illegal
There were
because
clearly
who
some
knows
PR optic
what it
issues there, which I agree with, but it's important to know what he did that was wrong. I'm not saying that you have the answers and we'll
Yeah,
never know, but what has he been accused of doing that's illegal?
right. So what he was accused of doing illegally was one, the pay issue, but then
Yeah.
there was a second set of charges that came out after his arrest that frankly the evidence for which only came to light because of his arrest. So
Okay.
when he was arrested, Nissan had teams of lawyers, either in-house lawyers and one of their outside law firms lawyers around the world ready to pounce on Carlos Ghosn's properties in various
Yes.
cities. And the thought was that there is probably a host of evidence of further wrongdoing out there, or at least evidence to back up what we're looking at right now, which is the compensation side of things. And in Lebanon, there is a Nissan dealer called Rimco. And in Rimco's office, Carlos Ghosn's secretary, where he maintained an office there in Beirut, where the Ghosn family's
Yes.
ancestral home is. And that secretary used to work for Carlos Ghosn's personal lawyer, a man named Fadi Gibran. And Fadi Gibran had passed away a number of years ago. But she still had a hard drive that contained all of her work for Carlos Ghosn at that time. And Nissan lawyer seized that. And in that, they obtained a massive trove of communications between Carlos Ghosn, this lawyer, and a number of individuals in the Middle East that showed movement of funds between those Middle Eastern people and Carlos Ghosn. And then an investigation ensued to see if there was any connection between that money that went to Carlos Ghosn
Yes.
and monies to Nissan and monies to Renault. And the reason why that connection was being looked into is because the person who was providing the funds to Carlos Ghosn was a Nissan and Renault distributor in the Middle East, a man named Suhail Balwan.
Hmm.
So that quickly became they called it a breach of trust charge, but ultimately was what you and I would probably know of as theft or a kickback, where the allegation was that Nissan and Renault, well, at this time, the investigation was only about Japan and Nissan, but
Yes.
they had sent millions of dollars worth of incentives to this person's business in Muscat, Oman, to help build out the dealership and
Yes.
incentivize vehicle sales. But then about $50 million between Renault and Nissan was sent from this Omani businessman and his associates into Carlos Ghosn's bank accounts.
So that's the
Which
kickback.
that's the kickback portion. That it was these bonuses were bogus. according to prosecutors and the companies. Um, and that they were and that the dealerships was merely a route through which to transfer money to Carlos Ghosn. And he used this money to, among other things, buy a yacht. And because every story of corporate malfeasance needs a good yacht, and
Yes.
also to invest in Silicon Valley with his young son. So the allegation was that this was theft. Carlos Ghosn maintains that the funds were not Renault and Nissan money, and this is something that would be hashed out in a court of law. But to me, even if we never learn whether or not Carlos Ghosn is guilty of a charge of breach of trust in Japan,
Yes.
it still raises, sort of really interesting questions that we examine in the book, like why Carlos Ghosn thought it was a good idea to take $50 million from his business partner at the companies he ran and use it to buy a yacht and run a sort of private side enterprise.
Yes. And it
So
doesn't seem
that,
like a lot of money. I mean, it's only 50 million relative to
well,
what he was
especially
putting
if
at
you
risk.
think of the cost to him personally.
Yes.
Right. So Carlos Ghosn was like a shoe-in for the Automotive Hall of Fame. He's talked about in the same, conversation in the same breath as like Lee Iacocca, Bob Lutz,
Yes.
um, the sort of the greats of the Sergio Marchioni, the greats of the automotive industry. And now everybody is going to remember him first and foremost, not for what he accomplished as a CEO, but when he did as a criminal suspect, which was to flee Japan by hiding in a box aboard a private
Yes.
jet.
That is going to be the soundbite that's going to define him.
Yeah, and in the end, like $50 million is objectively a lot of money, but that is a huge cost to pay.
Yes. And I believe he cannot leave Lebanon at this point.
No, he can't, not without risking arrest, because he is in Lebanon in large part because that country does not extradite its citizens, and he is a
Yes.
citizen of Lebanon, Brazil, and France. And so he will risk arrest and deportation to either France or Japan if he leaves that country. Bit of Napoleon and Elba to the Carlos Ghosn tale.
Yes. So I want to lay out what I've heard so the audience is able to follow us, okay?
Sure.
Because it's an interesting story and there's a lot of moving pieces here that are still moving. So you've got the CEO of one of the most respected CEOs in the world who is legally allowed to set his own compensation, but he sets up a scheme whereby he basically wants to take half his compensation and report it and defer his compensation until later. And that the problem there is that he needs to report his full compensation, which he's not doing, but it doesn't look like it's a big tax savings. On the other hand, he seems to have taken a kickback of about $50 million that we know of from a business partner in Oman. Let's stepping out of the very interesting, saga of Carlos Ghosn and what he did. Look at Japan here a little bit.
Mhm.
Is this likely to prompt reforms in corporate governance in Japan, or do you feel that the way the Japanese would look at this is to say, well, Carlos Ghosn was never Japanese. We should have had a Japanese CEO. What do you think is likely to happen in corporate Japan as a result of this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there was a lot of talk at the time of the need to reform the way boards are structured in Japan and oversight of corporate leaders in Japan in the wake of his arrest. And a lot of talk about reforming the Japanese justice system, which we can get into a bit too.
Yes.
If we look at what's happened to just Nissan since Carlos Ghosn's arrest, since his arrest, they have overhauled the board layout to add a lot more independent board directors, outside and
Yes.
independent board directors, with the thought that independent oversight of management would have avoided a lot of at least the compensation side of things. So there is some change that has come, and I think a lot of corporations are adding outside board directors, but they're adding the bare minimum, whatever the government and regulators have decided they need to add, which I think is 1/3 of board members need to be outside directors. And I think in some cases, there is a bit of a fig leaf on these outside and independent directors, whether or not they would normally be seen that way. So Japan's not a country that changes easily or
Yes. Or
quickly.
fast. Yeah.
I would not be surprised if 10 years from now, little had changed in terms of how companies do business in Japan. And I still think that there is a bit of resistance to shareholder and outsider oversight on management decisions. I mean, the thinking here is very much, the people making the operational decisions should be left to make the operational decisions because they're the closest to the ground. Why should some person who has no expertise on what exactly we do at a sort of granular level be allowed to sort of dictate strategy and decision making?
Yes.
And look, Japan had many, and Japanese companies for many years had great success, and still have great success in our extremely well run organizations. But what was clear from the Carlos Ghosn saga is the reason why there is oversight of management decisions is because somebody always has to be watching.
Yeah. So coming back into the story of Carlos Ghosn and his role here, someone had to come forward to say he was allegedly doing these things. So someone had to break out of this Japanese culture of showing reverence to elders and so on. But my question is more around the sourcing for this book. Given the culture and how people are so hesitant to speak up, how did you go about getting the sources to back up everything?
Very carefully. I mean, look, like reporting out, even in the news stories, reporting out something like this
Yeah.
is extremely difficult. And without being able to get into too many details, what I can say is that we talk to people with direct and intimate knowledge of a lot of the things for which Carlos Ghosn was accused. And we obtained a number of documents, a number being a very broad term for the
Yes.
large stack of paperwork in my office in my house. And I'm sure in Nick's place in Paris, that sort of backs up a lot of the things that are in this book. And a lot of the stuff, most of the stuff in the book is backed up by documents. There's a lot of stuff that we had heard and, sort of
Yes.
that was probably true that we were heard related to us, but we tried to stick to the stuff that we could back up with documents.
So people came forward, they told their side, but they were also able to corroborate it with documents.
That is correct.
And what has happened to those people that exposed all of this? Are they heroes or not?
That's a sort of a large group of people, and
Yeah.
let me break them out into categories. So one of Carlos Ghosn's avenues of attack against his accusers, at Nissan in particular, was that their actions were driven by a desire to stop a merger between Renault and Nissan that Ghosn had been planning.
Yes.
And that was true, that a group of Nissan executives started a secret investigation against Ghosn with the desire, or motivated out of the desire, to oust him from the company and push him from the company because he was planning a merger that they felt they couldn't stop.
Yes.
That was the genesis of this. Now, what they turned up was way more than they had initially thought was there. They were looking at the compensation side of things, and frankly, at the time, a lot of attention was being paid to a handful of properties that Nissan had purchased for Carlos Ghosn's use in Brazil and Lebanon, a couple of multi-million-dollar company properties, including one that was renovated for over $10 million in Beirut, where Carlos Ghosn lives currently. And the money that was used for that came out of a VC company, a venture capital company that Nissan had set up to invest in Silicon Valley, but never ended up investing in Silicon Valley. It was just this pool of money sitting there that nobody was
Yes.
paying attention to anymore. So that was the focus of their secret investigation at first. And then a group of them took the initial findings to Japanese prosecutors to see if it rose to the level of a criminal investigation. And the prosecutors in Japan said, "We don't know. Let's see what you find out over a period of several months."
Yes.
And ultimately, it was the prosecutors who decided to go after Ghosn for the compensation related side of things initially. And that's how we ended up with the surprise arrest in November. But the genesis was fears of a merger. Now, whether or not you would consider those people heroes, I think probably depends on how you feel about the merger. If you're
Yes.
ambivalent about it or if you're for or against, I think would probably shape your opinion there. For that group of people, it's quite interesting that in most corporate scandals, what ends up happening is that the board is informed,
Yeah.
and it starts in the board of directors and then may filter out to law enforcement after law enforcement gets on. Very, very rarely do the people who are conducting the investigation sort of subvert the corporate governance of a company
Yes.
and put it in service of law enforcement, where really, as you'll see in the book, the entire audit and compliance arm of the company and their lawyers are put in service of a secret criminal investigation in Carlos Ghosn. It's just a very unusual scenario where instead of hiring an independent third party to conduct an investigation, it's really Nissan conducting an investigation in service of law enforcement in Japan. It's just a weird
Yeah,
situation.
I've never seen that before.
Neither had I. And then there's another group of people that I would sort of broadly classify as the collateral damage in this whole
Yes.
tale. One of which is Carlos Ghosn's co-accused on the compensation side of things, an American named Greg Kelly, who was the only one to stand trial in the Carlos Ghosn case, and he was acquitted on all but one charge. Ultimately, after 3 years in Japan, she was not able to travel home. And then there's dozens of people whose careers were either ended prematurely, over upturned, and then the companies themselves. I think both Renault and Nissan are roughly about 40% of the size that they were at the time Carlos Ghosn was arrested. Just a huge amount, and tens of thousands of people were laid off. Over 10,000, I should say, not tens
Oh,
of
so there
thousands,
has
but over
been damage to the companies as a result of this.
huge damage to the companies as a result of this. So it's just been a lot of collateral damage as a result of the arrests and subsequent decisions to unravel some of Carlos Ghosn's business strategies, which has just been sort of a painful restructuring process and a lot of layoffs and a lot of lost careers.
So, in thinking about all of this, you have a situation where the board delegates the compensation to the CEO legally in this case. A group of employees investigate Carlos going to block a merger. They don't go to their own board, they go to the prosecutor's office in Japan. And then the
hmm
prosecutor's office delegates the investigation to these employees to continue and see what they can find. What has the board been doing all of this time if its own employees are not going to them?
Look, the way that the people who conducted the secret investigation tell it is Carlos Ghosn had a rubber stamp board of directors, and that they couldn't go to the board without risking their own careers, that they weren't convinced that the board would back them and support them and look into this. Whether or not they were right, we'll never know, right? Who knows?
Yes.
But what's clear, and what is certainly comes out in the book, is how much of Nissan and Renault and the entirety of that alliance was run through Carlos Ghosn and operated only because of Carlos Ghosn. That there was
Yes.
this sort of fear that permeated, the senior levels of these alliance companies, that if Carlos Ghosn ever went, this whole mechanism could fall apart. And frankly,
Yes.
the people who were working on trying to get Carlos Ghosn money after retirement within the company were motivated out of a fear that Carlos Ghosn would disappear, that he would,
Could you
perhaps
expand on
lose
that?
his position.
Could you expand on
Yeah,
that point?
I should. So Carlos Ghosn had for a number of years talked about potentially retiring, and he had received job offers from many automakers, including GM and Ford,
Yes.
to go work for others for a lot more money. And so there was just this concern, particularly within Nissan, that their greatest asset had taken a 50% pay cut. Here I'm speaking specifically about Greg Kelly and a couple other people. There was this concern that he took a massive pay cut and that he might walk as a result. And if he does, that Nissan would lose its greatest executive, but also the alliance would take a huge blow because the man who made it work would be gone. And so there was a lot of actions that were motivated by keeping Carlos Ghosn happy. Whatever Carlos Ghosn wanted, we should figure out a way to get it to him because he deserves it and we need him.
Yes.
There was a lot of decision making motivated by fear of what Carlos Ghosn might decide to do should he become unhappy.
Or
So
leave.
I think, or leave. And they call that the key man problem, right?
Yeah.
So any company runs into that if their man who has been running the company has been there for 20 years. any CEO reshapes the company and their image the longer that they're there. But here it was also a bit more than that, and then it was a weird situation in the alliance where Carlos Ghosn's authority at Nissan was that he ran Renault, and Renault wanted a merger, and Carlos Ghosn was the only person preventing that merger. And at Renault, a large part of his pull and influence came from the fact that he also ran Nissan, and
Yes.
Renault needed the Japanese company to be a willing business partner, and Carlos Ghosn was the only one that kept the Japanese from just picking up their toys and leaving the sandbox and just sort of going off to do their own thing. So there is just this image that Carlos Ghosn was the linchpin that held the whole thing together, that allowed him to stay at the top for as long as he did. And because, there's a lot of talk, certainly in the latter half of his time at the Alliance, about who was going to come after Carlos Ghosn, that he never really had
A bench
a
strength.
successor. Yeah. And that, likely successors kept leaving to go work for somebody else if Carlos Ghosn wasn't going somewhere or Carlos Ghosn fell out with them. So there was always a question of who would come next. And part of the reason that Carlos Ghosn was planning the merger was, one, as we were in the book, that he would have become a very rich man. But two, that it was this acknowledgement that the alliance relied so much on his ability to run two companies simultaneously. And that's not a real expectation for anybody else. And frankly, as we report in the book, for him either. There was a lot of
Yes.
sort of kabuki theater about, his supposed ability to run two companies at once. But part of the merger was to sort of bring the two companies together and make it look more like one company so that one person could run it.
So this is very interesting because the analysis you presented here is looking at how the other actors benefited as a result of what Carlos was doing. And it was in the interest of many of these actors for Carlos to keep doing what he was doing. But at the same time, the way you described it is the way you describe any autocratic government in the world. There's one man at the top, and he sets it up in such a way that he cannot be replaced.
Yeah, look, I think there's been a lot of accusations in the wake of Carlos Ghosn's arrest that he was this greedy dictator,
Sure.
and Carlos Ghosn takes great umbrage at that sort of characterization, and he has a point in one respect. So Carlos Ghosn's defense of himself in terms of whether or not he was a dictator or not was that he never really forced anybody to work together or to do anything on his behalf.
Yes.
And that is certainly true. In some cases, what problematic. And one of the reasons why Renault and Nissan today, after 20 years, despite promises to do so, share very few parts between their vehicles, was because Carlos Ghosn never had this mandate that they work together, that they find operational synergies, as they would put it.
Yeah.
And the reason why there was no merger for so long is that Carlos Ghosn never forced them to do it, even though it made sense in his mind increasingly as the years went by. But I think anybody who's been at the top for that long and who has a track record and the power base that he had within a company, like, he was clearly the man in
Yeah.
charge. There was no other who was the sort of ultimate arbiter of what that company was going to do strategy wise and operationally. Like, it was Carlos Ghosn. Like, and if you want to call that a dictator, then yeah, I think that's objectively true.
Well, let's leave aside the dictator term because I think there's a more interesting storyline here. You've got
Mm.
Carlos Ghosn, who's the CEO of two companies, and you've got basically a board that doesn't. I don't know anything about the board, but they don't seem to operate like a board.
No,
So,
that's accurate.
so it would be fair to say that everything that is happening is what he wants to happen because he's the only one with the power to make things happen.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. He was the man undoubtedly in charge, and the entire operations of the HR arm was devoted to keeping Carlos Ghosn happy and at the company.
So I've got to ask the most pressing question. Has the board been replaced or changed in any way since all of this happened?
The board at Nissan has. Now, I mean, look, there's two different stories here. I mean, the board at Nissan has been almost entirely replaced. There are a
Okay.
few holdovers from the previous board. There were two outside directors who were pre Carlos Ghosn, pre-arrest, that are still there, and then there was one sort of what they call a statutory auditor who
Yeah.
is now a full-fledged board member. So there are holdovers. At Renault, they always had what you would normally consider, at least what we would normally consider, a board of directors, and so that hasn't changed as much.
And in terms of this merger, was Carlos in favor of the merger or not? My guess is not because he didn't push it through.
It's a funny thing. I mean, Carlos Ghosn was very public until about 2015, 2016,
Yes.
and certainly to early 2018 is when it really starts to change, against a merger. He always said it doesn't work. There's a whole litany of failed attempts at merging the automotive industry. How am I going to take a quintessentially French company and a quintessentially Japanese company and push them together and try to make them into a single entity? It's not going to work. So he claimed.
Yes.
Um, One big thing happened in early 2018, which is that his mandate at Renault was up for renewal. And Renault's largest shareholder is the French state. And the French state had pushed forever for Carlos Ghosn to do something about succession and also to work towards a merger. And Carlos Ghosn had always resisted that, but he, for a variety of reasons, had very little leverage at this time. And so he accepts both mandates and starts working actively towards the merger. And that, I think, is what really turned the group of individuals against Carlos Ghosn within Nissan who started the investigation. That a lot of Carlos Ghosn's authority, as I mentioned before, stemmed from not only his saving of the company 20 years ago, but also because he was a bulwark against French desires for a merger between Renault and Nissan. And when Carlos Ghosn began working on the merger, and a lot of anonymously sourced articles began appearing in the press around the world that the two were considering a merger, that's when really the tide turned and the investigation really took off.
When you first read the story of Carlos Ghosn and what happened, it's easy to quickly pull out who's of the villain and who's not the villain. But as you go deeper into the story and the excellent reporting you and Nick did and the book, it seems as if there's failures on many, many sides. Yeah.
There are no good guys in this story.
There are no good
Absolutely.
guys, but there's no also truly easily discernible bad guy.
Mm.
There's not someone who's going to get all the votes when you dig into this because there seems to be an absolute failure of corporate governance on the side of Nissan.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, you hit the nail on the head here. And I think this is true when you really dig into any true story, any truly nonfiction story about things like this, is that there are very few good guys, very few bad guys. There's a lot of arrogant people and
Yeah, that
a lot
is
of
the
people
case with
who
most CEOs, right?
yeah, and also there was this perception, just to pick out one aspect of it on the
Sure.
compensation side of things. There was this perception within, Nissan and the group of people who were trying to get Carlos Ghosn a lot more money. That in Japan, yeah, sure, their declared cash compensation is low, but Japanese CEOs have a host of fringe benefits.
Yes.
And this sort of thinking that everybody does this is what gets a lot of people in trouble for white collar crimes around the world. And so in that sense, what happened within Nissan is not unique, but you're absolutely correct that Carlos Ghosn has spent a lot of time after his arrest, and a lot of his defenders have done so too, saying, it is ludicrous to think that Carlos Ghosn would somehow orchestrate a plan to pay himself a huge amount of money after retirement and that the board would be unaware or that senior executives within Nissan would be unaware. But there's a certain ingenuity about that argument, in that Carlos Ghosn had created a system by which nobody knew what he was paid
That
for a
is
number of
true.
years, and that he had
But I just want to make a correction. He didn't create the system. That's a legal system under Japanese law, right?
yeah, it's legal, but the mechanism by which Carlos Ghosn determined his own compensation is unusual even in Japan.
Yeah. We don't
Like
even know
that,
what that is, to be fair.
yeah. I mean, the fact that Carlos Ghosn would annually decide how much Carlos Ghosn was paid is an unusual scenario even for Japan. It was
Yes.
not illegal. So long as his compensation was declared publicly, the company could use whatever means it thought fit to determine how much Carlos Ghosn was worth.
Yeah, to me, it seems as if Nissan and the board could have made a better case to explain why Carlos Ghosn was worth what he is being paid, a lot of this would never have happened.
You know what? I've had this conversation and I've asked senior executives at Nissan and, a lot of people involved in this. what would have happened if Carlos Ghosn had gone to shareholders and gone to his fellow board members and said, "Look, I'm worth $30 million a year. Pay me that, or I'm going to go work for GM." What would happen? And they say he would have been paid $30 million a year. Like the
Because
company would have backed him up on this, but the person who didn't want to fight for it was Carlos Ghosn.
yes, I mean that's
He didn't
that's
want to have to
the
make that argument.
that's the kicker here because it went against the culture and the image he had created for himself. And at the same time, if you look at the amount of value that's been destroyed by not being public about it, I mean, it's just the cost benefit analysis seems clear, right? In hindsight, that you should have gone public, should have got the backing, but bad decisions on many sides. Yeah.
Yeah, and look, say what you will about CEOs that make hundred millions of dollars a year. Like at least they go to the shareholders and say, "I'm worth it." You
Yeah.
know,
They take the heat.
like they take the heat, and that Carlos Ghosn wanted it both ways, and I think that's part of what got him in trouble.
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to the point we were making earlier, and I think you said it well. It's just in a culture where trust seems to be so central, it's almost a personal betrayal.
Yeah, and I think that was a lot of the shock within the rank and file of Nissan and in sort of Japanese society as a whole is that I mean, still to this day, I think what Carlos Ghosn actually did is poorly understood by most people.
Yes, I agree
Some
with that.
people think it was a tax evasion. Some people think that he somehow got this extra money in his bank account and just didn't tell shareholders and didn't tell tax authorities and didn't tell regulators, or that he stole a bunch of money from corporate coffers. Like that's not what happened, and it is way more complicated than that.
But I do have to ask a question. It's a very technical question, but I'm going to ask it because I'm not that familiar with the Japanese judicial system. So
Mm,
when Carlos Ghosn had his team, I think you mentioned Greg Kelly,
hmm
was setting up the plan to defer his compensation. Had his compensation actually been deferred at that point, or were they still
Well, so
planning
so
it?
that was the entirety of the legal debate, right? Was it deferred compensation or not? And Carlos Ghosn's position and Greg Kelly's position is that it was not deferred compensation. Not only was it not deferred compensation, because the finalized version of the close to finalized version of the plan was that he would be paid a consultancy fee after retirement, so that it was not deferred compensation. And the prosecutor's argument and the people who were accusing Ghosn within Nissan, their argument was that it was a fig leaf for compensation because you cannot defer compensation without disclosing it in Japan.
But it hadn't been
Um,
deferred yet, right? There was a
it had
plan to
no, it
do it.
had so yeah. So Greg Kelly's argument, because we only really know Greg Kelly's argument in full because Ghosn wasn't here for the trial. Greg Kelly's argument is that look, like it was literally impossible for me to defer the compensation or to finalize this post-retirement compensation plan, even if you think of it as a consultancy agreement, is because he can retire. Like, what could we have set and determined in terms of compensation for Ghosn after retirement? Like, unless it was actually deferred compensation, none of this could have been set and determined because you can't actually sign a post retirement consultancy agreement in Japan legally unless, he had already retired. So again, like it was a weird debate on the finer points of, the law at the trial. But ultimately, what it came down to was that the Nissan head of HR and a couple other executives within Nissan were working at ways to come up with a plan to throw a large wad of cash at Carlos Ghosn, saying that when you retire, we're going to give you this. We'll sign it right away. Don't go anywhere, sort of thing.
It sounds like a very strange point, but if they didn't sign it, there's nothing there, right?
Look, if in Carlos Ghosn's argument, and it's true, if Carlos Ghosn had died the day before he retired, his
He
family
has
would
no
have gotten
deferred
nothing.
compensation. Exactly.
Yeah, he
So,
would have gotten paid anything.
and the thing about business is it always comes down to the finer points of the law. That's one thing I've learned in my entire career. And I obviously know a lot less about this than you know. But at least on the deferred compensation side, it sounds like there was a plan to defer compensation, but there was no deferred compensation. On the kickback through Oman, I mean, I don't know what's going on there, but that sounds like something that needs to be explored further. But I think the point to be made here is that after the escape, none of this matters, does it?
No, None of this matters. I mean, look, like, and honestly, even if we never get an answer to whether or not Carlos Ghosn committed a crime, like, it's an important question, right?
Yes.
It's the lens through which we judge good and bad as a society. At that point, I get, but like, ultimately, if we had never learned, he still did these things absent of a criminal charge. And I think
Yes.
looking at those, like, those actions is incredibly revealing about Carlos Ghosn, the man, and the failings, as you put it, of corporate governance within Nissan is just a sort of a Shakespearean parable of the perils of bad governance within a company. You know,
No, I
there's a
think
lot
you
that I
make
think any company can take away from this.
you make a good point. I mean, as a CEO, you want to be transparent. I mean, that's your currency, right? Once you
Mm.
lose that transparency and trust with the public constituents, you don't really have much. So, irrespective of the nuances of whether or not it was deferred or not, the actions on Carlos Ghosn's side could have been better. But I find it quite ironic that he went from a Japanese prison to effectively being a prisoner in a house in Beirut.
Yeah, and my colleague Nick had the opportunity to ask him the question, was it worth it? That he traded a shot of clearing his name at trial for sort of a half freedom of living in essentially exile in a gilded prison in Lebanon. And he says absolutely. And I think one of the important aspects of the Carlos Ghosn tale that we haven't quite touched on yet is the whole Japanese judicial system.
Oh, yes, I've heard about it. There's
So
like a 90% conviction rate or something like that.
99 point, depending on the calculation, 6 or 8% conviction rate.
Okay, so
Um,
basically, if they go after you, they're going to get you.
Yeah, a contested case, like Japanese prosecutors, by their own statistics, win over 99% of their cases. And there's a couple reasons why that happens, or a couple theories about why that happens. And on the Japanese prosecutor side of things, what they say is we're just really good at picking only the guilty parties out of a lineup.
So they go after the easy
Um,
cases.
yeah.
I want to make a point on this, Sean, because
Uh-huh.
you kind of set me up for this.
Hmm.
But if that's true, why is it, if they only pick the easy cases, why is it so hard for us to know if Carlos Ghosn did something wrong?
Well, look, and this is Carlos Ghosn's point, right? Is that it defies belief in a sort of Kim Jong Il winning 98% of the
Yeah.
democratic vote of
Yeah.
North Korea. That like that this could be an accurate statistic without any sort of malfeasance. And there's a lot of criticisms of the Japanese justice system, and the term they use is hostage justice.
Yes.
And what hostage justice is the system in Japan where it is very difficult to obtain bail before trial. And the critics say that holding a bail puts prosecutors in the system of extreme authority over the accused, where they are
Yes.
in prison, oftentimes in solitary confinement in these sort of strict confinement situations where you basically have to sit on the floor with your back against the wall in this L shape all day, except for when you are being interrogated by prosecutors. And in Carlos Ghosn's case, it was up to 12 hours a day, every day of the week, 7 days a week, without the ability to have your defense counsel present during those interrogations. And there's just this pressure to confess that, if you want to
Yeah.
get out of here, you want this to end, you want to get back out into society, there's an easy way to do that. Just tell us you did it. And that is what they call the hostage justice system. And it was the criticism that Carlos Ghosn made against the system. And frankly, it was something that, even people who live here like me were vaguely aware of. But, it was just incredible to see a guy like Carlos Ghosn imprisoned for over 100 days, questioned
Yes.
without the ability to have legal counsel during the interrogations, and that nobody seemed to bat an eyelid at this, and that this was just perfectly fine for something like a white collar offense, like essentially what boiled down to a paperwork violation. It was
And
just a crazy thing.
so it's very different from the common law system in Hong Kong and the way rights for not prisoners in this case, but accused, it's a very different system.
It is a very different system, and Carlos Ghosn, and one of the reasons why he said it was worth it for him to leave is that he was a 65-year-old man
Yes.
facing long odds at an acquittal, and a legal battle that would have taken, by his calculation, over 10 years.
Probably
And
tens of
there is
millions as well.
a lot of money, depending on how good your lawyers are and how
Yeah.
expensive they are. It would have cost him a lot of money. And so in Carlos Ghosn's mind, win, lose, or draw, he was going to come out of this probably a dead man or with nothing left of his life. And there is something to that because I mean, the first set of charges, which I think are arguably less serious about surrounding the whether or not Carlos Ghosn intended to pay himself deferred compensation, was a process that took 3 years to get a verdict on. And that was
Yes.
the easy part. He was facing the much more complicated trial over the Oman related issues.
Yeah.
So it is feasible that after appeals and everything else like that, he was facing a 10-year legal battle.
And it is the 20th anniversary of the collapse of Enron. And I remember when Arthur Anderson was indicted,
Mm,
but they went on to be acquitted by a judge eventually, I think about 4 or 5 years later.
mm.
So I think the point you're making is very true here, that it's a long process and he had to balance that out against what he was going to go through, even if he turned out to be innocent.
And there is this sort of fascinating part of it, of how this ended up, that really sort of permeates Carlos Ghosn's character throughout the book. And that Carlos Ghosn's great success as an executive came from his ability to analyze a problem with a cold logic, and rather than seeing the reasons why you can't get something done, to see the solution. And
Yes.
Carlos Ghosn saw the long odds at an acquittal and the fact that it would have been realistically a decade-long legal fight. And he said, "I'm not doing that. I am going to just leave." And so
Yes.
very soon, very soon after the charges on Oman and Carlos Ghosn's release for a second time on bail, he begins planning the escape. That was almost immediately what he started doing.
Fascinating thing. Sean, one thing I'm going to compliment you on and commend you on. What I like about the way you have structured the book and your reporting on this is that you have basically only followed the facts as opposed to picking a narrative in advance and pursuing it. Because then when you have this conversation, it's very clear there's so many sides to this. And we're probably never going to figure out what happened, but there's no clear bad person. Yeah. It just seems as if a lot of bad decisions were made and a lot of people need to self reflect and fix things. So I commend you for that style of writing and that objectivity.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of things that Carlos Ghosn did that look awful like crimes.
Yes.
And there's certainly a lot of people who should be held to account for their actions. It's not like we should, sort of attribute this to some faceless corporation being run
Yes.
improperly. There's a lot of individuals who should be held accountable for the actions they did, including Carlos Ghosn. But you're right, like the goal of this book was not to indict Carlos Ghosn, and the goal of the book was not to adjudicate guilt or innocence on the part of any parties. It was really to sort of examine his life for us to understand the most baffling aspect of Carlos Ghosn's tale is
Yeah.
why anybody would think it's a good idea to gamble what ultimately is a 40-year legacy of excellent track record and superlative success for
Yes.
a couple $1 million. It's not something any reasonable human being would do.
Yeah, that's the part I don't get because he's done something I think no one has done. He's a foreigner who made it to the top of corporate Japan.
Yeah, it's very, very
So
rare.
rare.
And most Japanese people didn't think he could do it. That was part of his legend, is that he sort of defied what was an accepted truth, is that foreigners couldn't run a Japanese company, and he proved them wrong.
Yes, and he did a very good job. And if you look at the wealth that's been destroyed and jobs lost, it's a sad tale all around. But you've made it very entertaining, Sean. I want to thank you for what's going to be, I think, one of our best podcasts that we're going to put out. It's a fascinating story, and I love the way you analyze and stitch all the pieces together. So I want to thank you for that.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. It was a great conversation.
Have a great day in Tokyo, and we'll definitely speak soon. Take care. Ciao.
Thank you so much.